Brothers by Grania Hallahan. Lock, trees, a solitary cloud. The two brothers traipsed down the slope and clambered into the boat in an unsettling silence. Despite their close blood relationship, there was nothing physically to suggest that the two were related at all. Kieran, the older of the two, had a round, bloated stomach that caused his shirts to stretch in an unsightly way across his middle. Pink flesh and black curly hair peeking out between the gaping fabric. Ale and pub food and takeaways and an addiction to tobacco had been combined with laziness and an aversion to exercise. These are the things that caused Kieran's paunchy face and rotund middle. Niall stepped cautiously into the boat. He was his brother's opposite, small, dark, careful. His face was marked with freckles, and they gave him a misleading look of youthfulness. He had pale blue eyes that always seemed to be wet with tears, and when he tried to look at someone directly, his head always ducked to the side with uncertainty. His brown hair had never greyed, nor thinned, and instead had continued to sprout in thick, soft, unruly curls all over his head. When nervous, his hands would run through his curls rather boyishly, as if he were a shy kid on the first day of school. Sat in the boat, his leg jiggled up and down, and his hands tap-tap-tapped the wooden sides. When Niall spoke, it came out as a hoarse whisper, as if his voice had become lost somewhere between the vocal cords and the mouth. He looked at the stones at the bottom of the lock shimmer in the sunlight like coins at the bottom of the wishing well. I wish, he thought, I wish. The lock rippled as the boat disrupted the water, and ribbons of waves petaled out as they guided their way into the centre of the loch. Niall looked out at the shadows falling from the fir trees and guessed it was about midday. The brilliant blue sky had not been blighted by clouds all day, and now he could spot a dark cluster making their way towards him. Ah well, he thought, a few hours' fishing will come first. Kieran set up his rod and loaded the bait onto his hook, and Niall watched him. The grubs wriggled and squirmed as the metal plunged into their centres, and in that moment Niall felt like the worm, trapped and pathetic, at the mercy of someone bigger, stronger, harder. Fire waved up inside and then washed away again. He went to speak, to ask Kieran what he'd been doing with himself all these years, but the words vanished on his tongue. Still, the silence hung between them. "Are yous gonna have a go or what?" he spat, opening a can of lager. And Niall, stirred from his thoughts, grunted in reply, and began setting up his own rod. The silence now broken, Kieran rambled on about how good the fishing was here, and how his man down in Cork had told him this was the place to go to catch trout, and how much better it was than the limestone lakes in the south. Mayflies buzzed overhead, and Kieran swatted them away irritably. "Ah, come on now," Kieran cried, delighted with himself. He leant forward and slowly got to his feet, pulling and yanking the line, already feeling for the net to scoop the trout up. Silver flashed and danced out of the water, and Niall sat back as the trout was fished out in the net, and then feebly twisted and jumped about at the bottom of the boat, its glittering scales half hidden by the tangled mess of the net. Kieran's lip curled into an arrogant, triumphant grin. "Didn't I tell yous?" he cried, and then said it again, picking up the now pathetically flapping body, and took out a small, black, Japanese-style stiletto blade from his boot. "Did you know this is the best way to kill him, Niall? Did ya?" And with a delighted flourish, he rammed the blade into the fish and gave an expert twist of the handle, severing the creature's spinal cord. The fish ceased all movements. Kieran wiped the blade on his jeans and then spun it round on his fingers. Without missing a beat, he began another monologue about the Japanese spear fisherman. Dropping his line into the water, Niall ran his tongue over his teeth and bit back the questions he wanted to ask. Not about the fishing, but about where Kieran had been for the last 18 years. The last time Niall had seen Kieran was when Niall himself was in the dock, about to go down after the judge had read out his miserable sentence. Niall had looked over to the gallery and seen his brother's haunch shoulders disappearing through the doorway, and until his car had pulled up outside his house last week, Niall had assumed he had either left the country or died. That day, Niall had sat in his cell and cried. He'd entered guilty pleas to hit and run and driving without insurance or a licence. The guard had pulled him over after spotting him driving the wrong way down a dual carriageway. Kieran had been in the back seat, shaking with laughter, just like he always did when he made Niall take him joyriding. It was Kieran who had taught him how to hotwire cars, and it had been Kieran who had made him steal the cars to use as getaways after he and his mates had been out on the pinch. It was Kieran's big mastermind plan, and Niall was always going to get a cut of the money the next time. Definitely the next time. But where was Kieran when Niall was arrested? Gone. Legged it. Kieran swigged the last of the can and opened his next one. His eyes were rolling. He'd been drinking before he'd picked them up. His monologue had moved on from fishing to Niall now. How great Niall was doing, and how Niall owed him a huge favour for all he'd done. Rage seemed to flood Niall's body, and he considered his anger as if he were a doctor observing a body that didn't belong to him. The palms of his hands tingled, and the taste of metal flooded his mouth. He noticed that his breathing was laboured and shallow, and begun to wonder if he was having a heart attack. Staggering to his feet, Kieran reached for another can and slipped on the blood mixed with the water in the hull of the boat. They lurched to one side from the sudden movement. The older brother's arms flapped in the air, desperately trying to regain balance, and then he tipped over the edge and splashed into the freezing water. Niall didn't move. Kieran went down like a stone and then bobbed back up, his head a little cork of indignity, arms splashing and flailing. The clouds had reached their crescendo overhead. The sky darkened and rain spattered before a clap of thunder and the downpour started. "Help me, you gobshite!" His voice gurgled as water slurped down his throat. The lock took him prisoner. Thick jeans and a heavy jumper, sodden and dragging him down. Niall pulled the anchor up and took the oars, dipping them into the water, and rowed calmly back to shore.
Mummy, what you saying?